Please join us in welcoming to the stage York Moore.
Well, of all of the complexities in this spinning world of wonder, there's perhaps nothing greater than the human self. The invisible algorithms that are catalyzed by our social media companies can't predict and dissect the human self. The greatest minds behind the most sophisticated social and political theories cannot delve the depths of the human self. It is a complexity beyond understanding. As the Bible itself, he rightly says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? See, the self is no singularity. It is a multiformed hydra sweeping the heavens with one head and dragging the murky depths of depravity with the other. And in between this capacity for grandeur and defilement exists the day-to-day experienced reality of being absolutely and utterly alone. Loneliness, pinging into darkness. We send ourselves out, our hopes, our dreams, our longings, our questions. And when they're met only with silence, there is this panic that we call loneliness, and there's nothing that we won't do to escape its grasp. You see, the human self is full of mystic equity, of grandeur, of wonder, never intending to be a singularity, but in our sin and in our brokenness, we devolve into something subhuman. We were never intended to be alone. And yet loneliness describes the experienced reality of millions of people living lives of relentless isolation and loneliness. The founder of the field of neuroscience, Dr. John Capiocio, documents the impact of loneliness on the mind and the body. He says loneliness has a wide range of negative effects on both physical and mental health, including depression and suicide. Cardiovascular disease and stroke, increased stress levels, decreased memory and learning, antisocial behavior, poor decision-making, alcoholism, drug abuse, the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and altered brain function. He goes on to say these aren't the only areas in which loneliness takes its toll. Lonely adults consume more alcohol, get less exercise than those who are not lonely. Their diet is higher in fat. Their sleep is less efficient. They report more daytime fatigue. Loneliness, listen now, also disrupts the regulation of cellular processes deep within the body, predisposing us to premature aging. Loneliness impacts us in deep and profound ways. Even at a cellular level, we devolve into something less than human as a singularity. But I have good news for you today. The gospel. The gospel is good news for the lonely because it is rooted in a story of transformation and victory over all that is fragmented and forsaken and forgotten. It is good news. Even at a cellular level, the gospel restores our souls and restores ourselves. It is good news. It is rooted in the life of a man who is acquainted with suffering and grief and loneliness. From his birth, seemingly forgotten in poverty, awash amidst the migrants who made their way to be registered by the superpower of their day in loneliness. From his manger birth, in exile to Egypt as they fled the infanticide and the ethnic cleansing under Herod, Jesus Christ was a man who was acquainted with sorrow and grief. And perhaps no greater expression than when in the path of totality, as darkness struck the land, hanging bloody on the cross, Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Isaiah 53:3 tells us that he was despised and rejected, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Now, the suffering of Christ was immense, but it was not without missional purpose. It had redemptive power to transform our lives, to restore this mystic equity, this grandeur that we have been gifted by God. Though Jesus was lonely and suffered in immense grief, it had transformative power to restore our souls and to restore ourselves. You see, because in his loneliness, Jesus bore our infirmities. In his isolation, he carried our diseases. In his singularity, he was wounded for our transgressions, and in his isolation, he poured himself out, even to death on the cross for our sin. The gospel is good news for the lonely because it restores us to who we've been created to be. Even at a cellular level, it reverses the curse and restores us to God. Now, I want you to see this principle at work in our primary text here today. The words are not going to appear on the screen, so make your way on your mobile devices to Luke chapter 4. And as you're making your way there, I want to give some context. So we're going to look at verses 14 and following. But in verses 1 through 3, the context, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil, and he ate nothing at all during those days. And when they were over, listen now, he was famished. He enters into a personal season of famine. And the result is striking in verse 14. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him made its way throughout that surrounding region. You see, Jesus was already full of the Spirit. He was already obediently being led by the Spirit, but it wasn't until he stepped into a season of personal famine that he was transformed and filled with the power of the Spirit to launch his public ministry. The progression is significant. For a season, loneliness has a great impact on our lives. It increases our dependency on God. It puts us in touch with our true motives. It ignites our spirits and our souls, allowing us to see spiritual realities that were before hidden to us. For a season. For a season. We were made for community, but isolation has its purpose and its point. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has once said that one cannot know how to be alone unless he knows how to be with others. And one cannot know how to be in community unless he knows how to be alone. But again, it is for a season. Now, the famine of Christ was not about hunger. The famine of Christ was about isolation. It was about pressing into the darkness of loneliness. Now, for the Christian leader, there is great redemptive value for intentional seasons of isolation in prayer and fasting, to acquaint us with the mind of God, to tap into the power of the Spirit of God for a season. But I want to tell you that there are millions of people living lives of relentless loneliness all around us who have no opportunity to see that isolation redeemed. It merely takes them further away from who God has made them to be. Now, having said this, set the context, I want us to look at verses 14 through 20. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. And when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, and he unrolled the scroll, found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The word of the Lord. I want to tell you that God cares for the disenfranchised, for the forgotten, the forsaken, for peoples that are suffering in oppression and isolation. He cares for the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. They're on God's radar. The very story of Jesus is rooted in these realities. But I want you to know that Jesus doesn't just merely care for individuals. He cares for these populations and these people groups. The poor, the captive, the blind, the oppressed, the disenfranchised. Each of these communal realities has the individual impact of creating profound, unredemptive loneliness in people's lives. And for many of the poor and the oppressed, their isolation serves merely their further exploitation. For people with physical maladies, political and social disenfranchisement, their isolation furthers their exploitation. And these realities are a breeding ground, are they not, for things like suicide and drug abuse and self-mutilation. One doesn't need to look at the statistics very long to realize that impoverished people and disenfranchised people suffer from all manner of human depravity. We have a gospel that is good news. Now, I want to also say that loneliness doesn't play favorites, that you can be a person of great wealth surrounded by vocational activity and leisure, with all of the toys that come with the Western life, and be just as lonely as those who are oppressed. I live in a community surrounded by doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and nurses, and they have all the toys and beautiful families and beautiful children and well-manicured lawns. And so imagine my surprise at the raw, unfiltered confession of my friend and neighbor Tom. Now, Tom, his wife had recently relocated into our community from out of state. They had multiple businesses, and they lived very active lives, kept their home up, went on luxury vacations, had great businesses. And I was immediately drawn to Tom because of his candor and his availability, and so we spent many a summer night just admiring our lawns and talking about life. I'm that guy, yes, I admire my lawn. And so imagine my surprise when recently Tom leaned in and with his southern twang confessed to me. He said, "York, I can't tell you how lonely I am, brother." He said, "Ever since I've moved here, I just can't shake it. I'm surrounded with all of this. We keep busy lives, but I just can't find a connection with people." And that literally describes the lives of millions of people all around us. Even in the church, many people are surrounded by people, and yet they have no connection to those around them. I was looking for a quote. I felt like I needed to have a fantastic quote after coming from some of these speakers, and so I tried to find something maybe, from Spurgeon or somebody, and the only thing that I could find that would really fit well in this talk comes from a blog called The Angry Catholic. I like that blog. I know some angry Catholics, and so I thought, that's pretty good. And so listen to this quote I got off The Angry Catholic. "In the deepest caves and the darkest tundras, no heavier silence exists than that between 20 Americans waiting for a train. People everywhere, and not a drop of communion." And isn't that the case? Surrounded by people, but no communion, no companionship. But today I have good news for people waiting on trains, and for Tom, and for the people who are disenfranchised because of their oppression and despair. There is good news. The gospel saves us. The gospel restores us. The gospel lifts us back into this mystic grandeur that we were created for. It restores our souls and restores ourselves. And that is good news. A year of God's favor, a jubilee of the soul. And second, the gospel is good news because it restores us completely. It causes us to flourish in every way. It restores us to ourselves, it restores us to God, and it restores us to one another. And how does it do that? By delivering us companionship and communion with God. Two very powerful evidences that we are alive in the Spirit is that we have communion with God and companionship with other people. Now, unfortunately for many evangelicals, we have a myopic, diluted gospel in the United States because what we've done in our evangelism is we've preached a personal message of salvation so that the individual can individually repent to an individual God and individually go to heaven one day. Now, to be honest, there are other faith traditions that err on the other side of the line, and they compartmentalize the gospel's power, and they apply it to mental health and social justice and community programs. But I want to talk to us here as a family, the gospelizers, people who would pay money and take time off to travel across the country to go to an evangelism conference. We're the gospelizers, we're the belt notchers, so let's be honest with one another. Our problem is on the first side of the fence. And so although we're convinced that when we proclaim the gospel, we're not proclaiming some political theory or some psychological, therapeutic gospel, we're proclaiming freedom and forgiveness from the wrath of God who will judge the nations with fire and fury, right? But also, when we proclaim the gospel, we're not proclaiming an idea, some propositionally bound esoteric message about how we can personally go to heaven one day. No, we're proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, a God who is committed to restoring all things, the God who has said, "Behold, I make all things new." This is at the very foundation of the good news that Jesus came to preach. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." See, pinging into darkness, these first words of Christ, they go out into the formless waters of humanity with the same cosmological power as was uttered when God first said, "Let there be light." We have a gospel that transforms. In all of its simplicity, it dismantles systems that give rise to oppressed peoples. The gospel has the power to detangle the complexities behind social and political disenfranchisement. And I want to tell you that the gospel has supernatural life-giving power to literally open the eyes of those who are physically blind and those who walk in spiritual darkness. After Jesus was restored from his personal famine, he found the place in the scroll of Isaiah and chose to step into the famine of our souls. In the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be giving a series at one of the largest churches in Michigan in June and July. And so in preparation for that, I don't know if anybody here from like a mega church, you guys do things like just way cooler than we do from like the smaller churches. And so they said, let's get a video crew out there and we're going to tape you doing like the stories in your old community. Now you should know that I come from abject poverty and homelessness in and out. During my early years as a child, we were living on the streets of Detroit. And this church got it in their minds that it would be super cool to like take me to the hood to tell all my stories about my misery and woe. Now, if you can't relate to any of that, for people who have escaped from abject poverty, you don't spend a lot of time looking in the rearview mirror, I'll tell you that much right now. And so when they asked me to do this, I'm not going to lie, I was a bit nervous. I tried to dissuade them. I gave them alternate ideas, but they were insistent. And so when we rolled up to the old hood with all of our fancy clothes and fancy cars and fancy video equipment, not only did we look incredibly out of place, I was very nervous. All of my swirling fears of isolation and disenfranchisement, the fears of being trapped in poverty, came swirling back in an instant. As we did take after take in the front of the shell of this house, all of those fears of loneliness came back for 2 hours as we did take after take after take. And I could hardly keep my emotions in check during this time. Now, this experience just happened a few days ago, actually a week ago today, so this isn't ancient history. And so it took me back, and to my surprise, my next-door neighbor was still living there, and she came out with tears and a hug, and she began to tell me the updates of her life. And as I heard more about drug addiction and shootings and her own daughter being murdered in her 20s, it brought me back, and in my selfishness, I imagined what my life could have been like had I not escaped poverty. It was a traumatic experience. Now, I believe that I can tell you the day and the hour when I was eternally saved, but I'm a big believer that we need to be continuously saved. And a week ago today, I needed to be saved all over again. I needed the presence and the power of the gospel to deliver me from the despair and the fear that I had experienced in loneliness and disenfranchisement. Standing in front of that shell of the home for 2 hours, I needed Jesus all over again. As gospelizers, we need to make the gospel more than just saving people from the sure eschatological hell to come. We need to deliver people from the temporal hell that is now. Now, as my next-door neighbor began to share her life, as I snapped out of my bout of selfishness and really started listening, I just asked if I could lay my hands on her and pray for her, and she agreed. And so I laid my hands, and the power of the Spirit came. She began to tremble. We began to weep. The video crew was looking at me as if I was off script, but this was really the reason why we had come. And as we got done praying, she showed me the scars from her self-mutilation. She showed me the deep wounds from her attempted suicide and said that she had met God through her near-death experience and that she was trying hard to live amidst the trash and the toxic fumes and the boarded-up houses around her. And in that moment, I want to tell you how God used evangelism and prayer in my life. It transformed me in that moment because I experienced companionship and communion on the streets of my despair and isolation. A lot of times as evangelicals, we get it in our minds that we're the great saviors of the world and that we're going out to do a good deed. I want to tell you that evangelism is one of God's best tools to transform you from the inside out. God uses evangelism in our lives. And so the gospel is good news for little boys living in abject poverty and women cutting their pain away after the loss of a child. It's for people waiting on trains. It's for people living busy lives, but inwardly the tediousness and despair of loneliness is eating them up from the inside out. The good news recreates us. It restores ourselves. It restores our souls to who we were made to be. It restores this mystic equity that God has deposited within us. It is not simply a message about leaving this world and going to a better world. It is about becoming human again. Lord, I thank you for these sisters and brothers and for what a wonderful opportunity to come and speak well of you, Jesus. It's all about you. We love you. We love you, Jesus. And we ask, Lord, that you would recreate us into your image, that you would use evangelism in hard places with difficult people, with people who are hard to reach, with people who are lonely, that you would use us not only in their lives and in their communities, but that you would use it to save our souls. Lord, may we never give up on the power of the gospel to transform us. May we never merely be conduits of a good news message, but that we would always be recipients of it. In Jesus' name, amen.